right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is 5:03 p.m. We have a general government pension actuarial report from Jason Franken. Jason, come on up.
Good evening. As mentioned, my name is Jason Franken, and I am an actuary with Foster & Foster. I'm here this evening to sort of give a high-level overview of the Dearborn Heights employees retirement system. So this covers all employees other than the police officers and firefighters. I know the second half of the presentation this evening will be on that particular plan. But we are here tonight, or I am here tonight, to talk about the general employees plan. So this plan is in place to provide retirement benefits to everybody. Once they leave the city, they retire. The plan provides those retirement benefits. The funding of the plan is really the most important thing. From an actuarial perspective, that's why I'm here, is to calculate each year what the liabilities of the plan are, compare that to the assets, and then determine such financial metrics as the funded ratio, the required contribution, all of those things to give you an idea of where the plan is. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the 2022 report. I think everyone has a copy of that report, but this 2022 report is actually based on data that was collected as of July 1st of 2021. So we use data 1 year in the past to set the contribution for the fiscal year that will be starting on July 1st of 2022. So the contribution here within this report is determined, like I said, based on last year's information. The funding method and the contribution, is determined based on your funding policy. And there are really two main parts to the contribution requirement. There's the normal cost. That's the value of the benefits that are being earned by the active employees. So each year they earn an additional year of service. They could potentially have pay raises. So at the end of the year, their pension benefit is larger than it was at the beginning of the year. That's what the normal cost covers, those benefits that are earned during the year by the active employees. The second piece, and for most public plans across the country, this is a very significant piece, is the amortization payment on your unfunded liability. The unfunded liability is the amount of liabilities that you have that are not currently covered by actives. So when you have more liabilities than assets, it's called unfunded liability, and there's an amortization payment to eliminate that unfunded liability over time. It's very similar to a mortgage. So this unfunded liability arises over time when there are, if there was a benefit improvement, for example, or if the assumptions are, the asset investment experience, for example, doesn't live up to our 7% assumption. If we only earn 6.5%, and we're assuming 7, there's new unfunded liability that's created. So those are really the two main pieces of the contribution requirement. The important thing to understand is that regarding the amortization and the contribution requirement is it's designed to increase over time. We're using what's called the level percentage of payroll approach, and we're assuming that payroll increases by 3.5% per year. So as payroll increases, your contribution requirement is also designed to increase. In an ideal world, we would be contributing the same percentage of payroll each year, but as time goes on, as our salaries increase, our contribution requirement is also designed to go up with that payroll. So in general, you should expect that your contribution requirements are going to go up over time. This particular year, for this plan, the contribution actually went down, and that was attributable to the investment experience that we had that was, very, very strong. So another thing to consider is that the investment returns that we earn, we're assuming 7%. We're going to get 7% each year. Last year, the fund actually earned 31.3%. So yeah, very, very strong returns.
Can I get your phone number?
Hey, well, I'm the actuary. I don't manage the money, so I take zero responsibility for those strong investment returns, just like I'm taking zero responsibility for the returns so far during 2022. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And my question to you is, and thank you, that's amazing, 31% return, and you assumed 7%, and we can't make it 31. How often do we see such a margin of what we, or is it because 2020 has just been such unexpected that everybody was making money?
Yeah, I mean, it's rare that I see a 31% return in a pension fund. And actually, one of the plans that I work with actually had about a 45% return.
Wow.
So it's rare to see those types of returns. And we're coming off really 3 strong years of investment returns. And so as we continue.
My second question
yes,
to you is
go
if
ahead.
we ever saw where, we see ourselves, other than 2008, a huge drop, or do we see the market kind of slowing down a little bit?
Well, I'm not an expert in the investment, market, but I will say if you paid attention to the markets, they're down 20% so far during 2022. So that 7% return assumption that we're using that again this year. And so far, we're probably going to be woefully short of that.
Who covers that?
Ultimately, the city is the plan sponsor, and they are required to, the city's required to make up any shortfalls in the funding of the plan. So one thing, we smooth investment gains and losses over a 5-year period. So that 31% that we had, it exceeded our assumption by 24%. We don't get to recognize that entire 24% gain immediately. We only recognize 20% of that gain, and then we recognize it for each of the next 4 years until it's fully recognized. Just like this year, I guess the year's about to end, your fiscal year's about to end. If we get a negative 5 or 10%, we're not going to take that entire hit immediately. We recognize the loss over a 5-year period. So the point of the investment smoothing is to eliminate the volatility that arises, from year to year. And so we have at this point we have over $5.3 million of unrecognized investment gains in the plan. So this year, when we have losses, it'll offset, some of those gains that we have, and the smoothing creates a more stable and predictable contribution pattern. So rather than going way down when you have 31% and way up when you have negative 5%, it's smoother and more predictable. So that's just part of the actuarial process. We try to eliminate some of the volatility because I know many public entities, I would say most public entities, they like some predictability in their contribution requirements when it comes to budgeting purposes, right? You don't want to have to contribute $1 million this year, $2 million next year, and then $500,000 the year after that. So that's really the point of the smoothing, is try to keep it, eliminate some of that volatility and create a more predictable and stable contribution pattern. Is there any other questions so far?
Chair.
Go ahead.
You said you guys assumed 3.5% increase in pay?
Payroll,
Is
yes.
that like a norm assumption, or this is?
Yeah, it's fair. That's a fairly common assumption. One thing that we are now required to do is in the state, and this is something that we've done. The actuary, as an actuary, we do this anyway, but it's been codified in the state of Michigan. Is we review our assumptions every 5 years, and so we adopt every 5 years. We have to do an experience study to look at the assumptions relative to the experience. Are there new mortality tables that have been released? And there was a new tables that were released in 2019. How has our salary increases and our payroll growth? How have those assumptions compared to the actual experience? And so, to the extent that the experience is different than our assumptions, we will adjust our assumptions to reflect what we think is going to happen going forward. So to the extent that those assumptions aren't in line, we do adjust those to better reflect what actually happens in the plan.
Sorry, you said the gain was 3.5 million last year?
So what I was saying, what I alluded to was the unrecognized investment gains, and it was 5.3 million. So we have over the last 5 years, the return to the plan has exceeded our assumption, the 7% assumption, by a wide margin. And so as of our valuation date, we have $5.3 million of gains in the plan that have yet to be recognized. So those gains are going to help us going forward. So this year, it seems like it's going to be a down year. Rather than getting a huge spike in your contribution because of that loss, we have these unrecognized gains that are in the plan that will help sort of, mute any increase to the contribution requirement.
So, I'm sorry, one more. I know you cannot see the future, I mean, with the market and stuff, but do you think whatever gain we have, do you think it's gonna cover whatever losses for this coming year?
It's tough for me to say. I would, yeah. Well, the good news about that loss is that we're only going to recognize 20% of it. So, in terms of the contribution requirement, we still have, those gains are going to help us. We're only going to recognize 20% of the loss. But if you're asking me, will the loss exceed that $5.3 million? I can't really say at this point. I just won't know until we have the data once June 30th passes.
Thank you.
Yep.
So Jason, what have you seen in terms of demographic assumptions, the changes in it here in society and then in this area specifically, as far as these numbers are concerned, and then also in terms of longevity, like the amount of years that, people are tending, obviously, to live longer, which obviously could have an effect as far as how much investments we would have to make as a city.
Yes. So I think the biggest demographic assumption that we all talk about as actuaries anyway, are the mortality tables. How long are people going to live? Because the longer they live, the more pension payments they receive, the more payments they receive, the larger the liability, the larger the contribution that the city needs to make to the plan. So historically, we have seen life expectancies increase. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there were new mortality tables that were released in 2019. The Pub 2010 tables, they're called. They're mortality tables that were developed entirely based on public pension data. And there are three general classes up to this tables. There's teachers tables, there's public safety tables, and then there are general employee tables. So the tables that make most sense here would be those general employee tables. And again, they are based on the latest and greatest data, and they are producing life expectancies that are much longer than, let's just say, the 1971 mortality table, or even some of the the RP 2000 table. So we are seeing life expectancies that are increasing over time. Additionally, not only do we use those tables, but we have to make adjustments to those tables. So what I mean by that is called generational mortality improvements. It gets kind of complicated, but ultimately what these generational improvements do is they adjust mortality in the future. So effectively, a 55-year-old today isn't going to live as long as a 55-year-old, 10, 15 years from now. So essentially, everybody has their own mortality table depending on how old they are today. And so these mortality improvements are built into your actuarial valuation. There has, over the last couple of years with COVID, there has been, there have been many articles written about, well, are people living less? Are life expectancies going down because of COVID and these type of factors? And ultimately, there's not enough data yet. We don't have enough information to say one way or the other, how big of an impact that COVID has on life expectancies. But there are updates annually to these at least there have been. Going forward, they might not necessarily be annual just because of, the data with COVID is a little tricky. But yes, life expectancies have increased, and that is increasing the liability that the city has.
It tells us that if you work for the city of Dearborn Heights, you're gonna be really happy after you retire. You're gonna live longer.
Well,
That's one of the benefits.
The
You guys are all
mortality,
blessed up here.
that's what you, that's part of your HR, your recruiting tool, is you're gonna live longer if you come to work here. These mortality tables are based on data from across the country, so it's not necessarily specific. Your plan isn't large enough to have enough to have credibility to develop their own table. So the data that's used in it is based on data from across the country and not specifically to the state of Michigan or to the city of Dearborn Heights. Okay, so I think I have a few minutes left. Just in terms of the results, I'll just give you a high level. This is, this subject is probably way too complicated for a 30-minute presentation, but there are multiple multiple sets of financial results that are included in an actuarial valuation. One, and the one that's probably most commonly referred to is when we're developing our contributions. So the funding results. This is what I've been talking about. And based on those funding results, your contribution is going down from $1.666 million last year to $1.545 million this year. So over $100,000 decrease to your contribution. I mentioned at the beginning that the trend is going to be for that amount to go up, but thanks to those strong investment returns that we've had over the last few years, especially last year, it actually lowered your contribution requirement. From a funded ratio perspective, your funded ratio increased from 74.5% to 77.9%. So, nearly a 3.5% increase to your funded ratio. That, these results are based on that smooth calculation. Those investment gains and loss, so that those $5.3 million of investment gains, those are not considered. They will be considered in future years. If we just look at on a market value of asset basis, your funded ratio is actually 86%. So those two numbers will converge as we recognize those in investment gains. But like I said, your funded ratio did take a big step forward this year as a result of those strong returns that the plan earned.
Where do you see most cities' funded ratios, percentages, in what range roughly?
I would say you're in 77% in the state is fairly common. I mean, we have some that are lower. We have some that are higher. I mean, I don't have a survey of all of the plans and what their funded ratio is, but I would say that around 78%, you're probably in the middle third for sure of plans.
And obviously considered pretty stable.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so one other thing to, I just wanted to note is that in our valuation, and it's on page 16, there is a section, it's called PA 202 reporting. And this is Public Act 202 reporting. This is, the Michigan Public Act. This is a Michigan rule from 2017. This requires us to measure the liabilities using a uniform set of assumptions. And that uniform set of assumptions is developed by the state, and every plan has to use the same set of assumptions. So, for example, the investment return assumption, that's really the only big difference between what we actually use and what the state is requiring us to use for disclosure purposes. They use 6.85% starting in our 2022 report. We use 7%. So As a result, the liability on this page is a little bit higher than what we, calculate when we develop the funding contribution. Again, just based on that 15 basis point different investment return assumption. So as a result, your funded ratio is a little bit lower here. The number that we're reporting to the state, it's 75.9% rather than the 77.9%. And again, this number isn't, we're not using this number in any other way other than to report to the state, because that's, those are the requirements, that particular investment return assumption. So they're again, it is a slight difference. Last year they used 7, they actually lowered it to 6.85%. We continue to monitor our assumption of 7%, and we will, look during our next experience study, we will determine whether or not an adjustment to that assumption is needed or makes sense.
Based on this report that you did, what were the 2 points that were your biggest concern, and what were the 2 points that you were most comfortable and impressed with after doing this?
Well, I think the biggest issue, the biggest thing to be impressed with was the investment return assumption. Not the assumption, excuse me, the experience. That's really strong return that we had this year really led to a significant increase. When you're smoothing over a 5-year period, it's difficult to have a 3.5% increase in your in your funded ratio. But that's exactly what happened here, because you earn over 31%. So that, to me, that's the one thing that really jumps out to me as being a positive. In terms of negatives, to me the one thing that I think we need to discuss with the pension board is the funding policy. So what I mean by the funding policy is, how are we developing our contribution requirement, specifically that amortization approach. Right now we're at a 20-year, we have, we're amortizing the entire unfunded liability over a 20-year period, and those payments are designed to increase at 3.5% per year. So we have a backloaded contribution approach, and it's if you consider a 3.5% compounding over a 20-year period, your contribution 20 years from now is going to be significantly higher than what it is today. And and as that period gets shorter and shorter, there's going to be a lot more volatility that arises and is in your calculation of your annual contribution requirement. If you have a 2008 type event where you lose 15-20% and you only have 5 years to pay it off, well, that's going to lead to significant increases to the contribution requirement. So I think over time, developing a contribution funding policy that is better suited for the long term is something that I think we need to work on. It's not critical at this point, but I think it's something that we need to be looking at here in the very near term.
Rather be safe than sorry.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Council Chair?
Yes, go ahead, Councilman.
So can you just go briefly with the table with the unfunded liability? Like, how do you come up with those numbers? I know we're going for 20 years. It's on page 11.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So page 11. Okay. So what? So you're looking at section 8, section H. So that what this section is intended to show you is based on your funding policy that I just talked about. What does the current amount of unfunded liability look like over time? It doesn't look at, okay, what happens if we only get 5% versus 7%. But this shows you currently we have $12.12 million of unfunded liability. Based on that 20-year payment schedule, next year we would expect your unfunded liability to be $12,101,000. So you can see there's only $25,000 of principal that's being paid down during the next year. And then the next, the year after that, it's still $12,044,000. So you're paying, you're paying off a little more because your contribution is increasing by 3.5%. So rather than paying $25,000 down, you're going to be paying $57,000 down.
So how come the increase goes big time between the year 2038 and 2042?
Well, that's because we're getting to the end, we're getting to that once we get to 2042, that's when our current 20-year amortization period ends. And so you can see how much sort of, backloading is sort of inherent here, because this year you're going to pay off $25,000 of unfunded liability, but in the last 4 years of this schedule, your unfunded liability is going to go from 5.4 million down to 0. So you can imagine how large those annual payments are going to need to be to eliminate $5.4 million of unfunded liability in that short of a time frame. So this really illustrates why I was, wanted to address that funding policy at some point. Is really there's nothing magical about that 20 years. It's just a date, it's just a time frame that was picked at some point in the past, and we walk down. We're currently down to 20 years. Really, this pension plan is going to be around forever. We should be funding it on a long-term basis and not just focused on any given 20-year period.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any other questions from council members? Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't mind, we're going to have, if you don't mind, John, coming up to the podium.
So, Jason, I know we have the 20-year amortization. The state right now has those set policies that they use. What is the amortization that they say is the common one, or the one that all the plans should post, so that all of the liabilities are equal amongst the state?
Well, so we develop our PA 202 requirements. Those are based on a 17-year amortization currently. But it is the same. It is a closed period, so it is 3 years shorter. But there's not a significant difference between that and where we are now. But like I said, my concern is, as that period gets shorter and shorter, it creates a lot of volatility and uncertainty. And coming up with a more long-term approach to funding, I think, is important.
Okay, thank you. We have another meeting right after this, right away. This is Act 345, Police and Fire Pension. But does anybody have any questions for Jason before we are done with him on the podium? Anybody on Zoom have any questions? I don't see any. Nope. Nope, I don't see nobody, right? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much
it.
for having me.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.